Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a hypothesis you might have heard about the idea that governments have intentionally concealed evidence related to what's often called the chemotherapy conspiracy.
That's right. We'll be looking into the core claims of this hypothesis.
And evaluating the reasoning, really, based on the information we've managed to gather.
Our goal here is simply to explore this idea impartially, without taking sides.
Exactly. So let's start with the claim itself. What's at the heart of this?
Well, the central idea posits that pharmaceutical companies, the term big pharma often comes up, are actively suppressing actual cures for cancer.
Suppressing cures, why?
The suggested motivation is profit, specifically protecting the huge profits they make from ongoing cancer treatments, like chemotherapy itself.
So the belief is a real cure exists, but it's deliberately kept hidden.
That's the core of the hypothesis, yes, that it's being withheld from the public intentionally.
Okay, to really understand this, maybe we should look back at how chemotherapy actually developed. Its history seems quite complex.
It really is. Our sources point to some key moments, starting way back in the 1940s.
The 40s? What happened then?
Well, there was the initial use of nitrogen mustard. It was used to treat lymphomas, and it actually generated quite a bit of hope initially. There was this real optimism, that maybe drugs could cure cancer.
But it wasn't quite the breakthrough hoped for.
The early results, they were promising for achieving remissions, yes, but those remissions often turned out to be quite short-lived.
Ah, okay. So that initial hope faded a bit.
It did. By the 1950s, you see a wave of pessimism setting in. Some quite prominent physicians started becoming critical. They'd see the early successes not last, and they began doubting if the National Drug Development Program could really find drug cures for advanced cancers.
Interesting. But even during that skeptical period, something else was emerging, something like targeted therapy.
Yes, exactly. That's what's fascinating. The development of 5-fluorouracil, or 5-FU, in the mid-50s. This wasn't just a general poison. It was designed based on an observation about tumor cells.
Oh. What was that?
Researchers noticed certain rat liver tumors took up and used uracil, a building block for RNA, much more than normal cells. So 5-FU was designed specifically to interfere with that pathway, kind of an early targeted approach.
And did 5-FU prove effective?
It did. It showed activity against various solid tumors. And remarkably, it's still a cornerstone treatment for colorectal cancer today.
Wow. So that early targeted idea really had legs.
It highlighted the potential, designing drugs for specific biological differences in cancer cells, rather than just, killing all fast-growing cells.
Okay, so moving into the 1960s, that seems like a period where persistence was key for chemotherapy development.
Absolutely. Developing chemo in the 60s required, real conviction, a strong belief that drugs could eventually beat cancer. And the proof, the real validation, came with cures achieved in childhood acute leukemia and also advanced Hodgkin's disease.
And when you say cures, you mean people were actually definitively cured. The cancer gone for good.
That's the key point. Research, especially using leukemia models in mice, and early clinical trial data started suggesting that, yes, complete lasting eradication was possible for some blood cancers. It wasn't just about temporary remission anymore, a huge shift from the earlier pessimism.
And combination therapies like MOPP for Hodgkin's lymphoma, that was a big step too, even with some resistance.
MOPP was definitely a turning point. The idea was based on cell growth kinetics, hitting cancer cells at different stages, using multiple drugs to maximize the kill. But this multi-drug approach was pretty radical then. Some of the medical community were skeptical, preferring single drugs.
So it needed strong advocates.
It really did. But the results were hard to argue with.
How so?
MOPP showed a major improvement in survival for advanced Hodgkin's disease, which previously had a very poor outlook. And that success then opened the door for similar combination strategies in other lymphomas, like CMOPP in the 70s for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which also led to cures for many patients.
The impact on survival statistics must have been quite dramatic.
It really was. Think about this. By 1984, in the U.S., mortality rates for childhood leukemia and Hodgkin's disease had dropped by around 65%.
65%. That's huge.
It is, and it's a direct result of adopting these new chemotherapy regimens. Pretty compelling evidence of their value, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's also interesting how that era seemed to pave the way for today's targeted therapies.
It did, sometimes indirectly. There was a special virus cancer program, started in the 60s. Initially, it was looking for viruses as cancer causes, but it evolved. It shifted more towards molecular biology.
How did that help?
Well, that research led to identifying oncogene genes that can drive cancer and tumor suppressor genes, which normally control growth. Understanding these basic molecular pathways was absolutely fundamental for developing the targeted drugs we rely on so heavily today. So even a program with a different initial aim contributed significantly.
So bringing us to the present day, how does chemotherapy fit into the picture now with all these newer therapies around?
Chemotherapy is still very much a critical piece of the puzzle. It's a key component in personalized treatment for many cancers, including solid tumors like lung cancer.
It's not just one thing called chemo, though, is it?
Not at all. There are many, many different chemotherapy drugs that are often used in specific combinations or integrated with other treatments, surgery, radiation, targeted therapy, immunotherapy now too.
What about the side effects? That's often the first thing people think of with chemotherapy. Is the perception accurate?
It's true that side effects are a reality for many patients, but the perception that it's always severely debilitating isn't quite the full picture anymore. There have been really significant advances in supportive care medications to help prevent or manage things like nausea, for instance.
So management has improved.
Definitely. And the side effects themselves vary a lot depending on the specific drugs used.
You mentioned things like fatigue, nausea, hair loss are common.
Yes, those are frequent short-term ones. Also changes in appetite, bowel issues, sometimes cognitive fuzziness, chemo brain mouth sores. Long-term side effects are less common, but can happen with certain drugs. Things like nerve damage, peripheral neuropathy, or sometimes heart problems.
But it's very individual.
Very much so. Some patients tolerate it much better than others or better than they expect.
And how it's given, the dosing, that's evolving too. I read something about body surface area dosing being questioned.
That's right. The traditional way of dosing based on body surface area, or BSA, has faced scrutiny. Especially for obese patients, it might not be optimal. Research is showing that individualizing the dose, aiming for a specific level of drug exposure in the patient's bloodstream, can actually improve outcomes and reduce toxicity.
So more precise dosing.
Exactly. Studies with drugs like 5-FU, which we mentioned earlier, have shown benefits for this kind of personalized dosing approach.
Can you briefly explain how these drugs work? What are they doing to the cancer cells?
They work in different ways. Some, like vinca alkaloids or taxanes, mess with microtubules. These are tiny structures inside cells needed for them to divide, disrupt those, and the cancer cell can't multiply.
Okay.
Others, called topoisomerase inhibitors, interfere with enzymes that are crucial for copying and reading DNA. So they stop DNA replication and transcription, which ultimately kills the cell.
And it's not always given through an IV drip.
Correct. While AVI is common, chemo can also be given as an injection into muscle or intrathecally into the spinal fluid for central nervous system cancers. Also, subcutaneous injections just under the skin or even topically as creams for some skin cancers.
And safety for healthcare workers handling these drugs is a big concern.
Absolutely. Hospitals and clinics have very strict protocols for safely handling chemotherapy agents to minimize any exposure risk for the staff.
Okay, so we have this picture of chemo, its history, its ongoing role, the improvements. Now let's circle back to the conspiracy hypothesis. What are the main arguments against the idea that a cure is being suppressed?
Well, one major argument comes down to financial incentives, but perhaps not the ones the hypothesis focuses on.
How so?
Think about medical insurance companies. They're the ones paying the often enormous bills for long-term cancer treatments. If a genuine effective cure existed, especially a relatively cheap one, insurers would have a massive financial incentive to embrace it, even push for it. It would save them fortunes.
So the idea they'd conspire to suppress a cost-saving cure seems counterintuitive.
Economically, yes, it doesn't quite add up for them.
What about the structure of the drug industry itself? It's not just big pharma, right?
Exactly. A lot of cutting-edge medical innovation, especially in cancer, actually comes from smaller biotech companies, startups, university spinoffs. Now, imagine one of those companies found a real cure. The potential reward financially, reputationally, would be astronomical. Keeping that secret in such a competitive environment, it seems incredibly improbable. The incentive to reveal it would be overwhelming.
That makes sense. Another point often raised is the nature of cancer itself.
Yes, and this is crucial. Cancer isn't just one single disease. It's a collection of, well, over 40 different types are often cited, maybe more, depending on how you classify them. And each type has unique features at the cellular molecular level. Even within one type, say breast cancer, there are huge variations from patient to patient.
So the idea of one single cure for all cancer
Is scientifically very unlikely. Given the diversity, different mutations, different pathways driving the growth, it's much more probable that we need different tailored approaches for different cancers and even different patients. The idea of a single magic bullet just doesn't fit the biological reality.
And what about survival rates? If a cure was suppressed years ago, wouldn't we expect survival rates to be stagnant?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But the data shows the opposite. Across many, many types of cancer, survival rates have significantly improved over the last few decades.
So progress is being made.
Undeniably. It indicates advancements in treatment, better chemo, targeted drugs, immunotherapy, earlier detection, supportive care, rather than some deliberate stagnation implied by suppressing a cure. These improvements, even if not a single universal cure, are making a real difference.
Now, this kind of theory, the powerful entities suppressing something beneficial, feels familiar. Are there historical parallels people draw?
The tobacco industry example often comes up, how they concealed the harms of smoking for decades. But there's a key difference. The tobacco industry was hiding information about a negative effect of their product. They weren't hiding a miracle cure they possessed.
Good point. They were protecting their existing product by hiding its dangers.
Exactly. And even then, that massive, well-funded effort at secrecy eventually failed. The truth came out, and it hurt the industry significantly in the long run.
It also seems like maintaining such a huge conspiracy involving potentially thousands of scientists, doctors, regulators across the globe for decades
Would be incredibly difficult, bordering on impossible. Think of the number of people who would need to be involved, stay silent, never have a crisis of conscience, never leak anything, over generations even. Large-scale, long-term conspiracies are just inherently fragile and prone to exposure.
And we see this theory persisting, especially online, despite these counterarguments.
Yes, the idea that Big Pharma suppressed a cancer cure remains quite popular on social media and other online spaces.
Yeah.
Surveys sometimes show a surprising percentage of people believe it's at least possibly true.
And that overlaps with the broader issue of cancer misinformation online.
It does. There's a lot of misinformation about cancer treatment online, unfortunately. Sometimes it looks quite convincing, presented very professionally. This can lead people down dangerous paths, maybe relying on unproven natural cures instead of evidence-based medicine.
Which could potentially harm their health.
Absolutely. It's vital to distinguish between, say, complementary therapies like meditation or gentle exercise, which can help quality of life during standard treatment,
Right.
and unsubstantiated claims of miracle cures that lack scientific backing. Using the latter instead of proven treatments or using things that interfere with conventional therapy can have serious negative consequences.
So, bringing it all together, we've looked at the claim, the history of chemo, its current role, and the arguments challenging the conspiracy idea.
From the complexity of cancer itself, making a single cure unlikely, to financial incentives for insurers, the role of biotech, and the steady improvements we have seen in survival rates. The evidence seems to point away from a deliberately suppressed universal cure.
The historical development shows a difficult, incremental process of discovery, setbacks, and real progress, rather than hiding a finished solution.
Exactly. It paints a picture of ongoing scientific effort against a very complex set of diseases, not conspiracy of obstruction.
While the appeal of a simple answer, a hidden cure to something as frightening as cancer, is understandable.
It really underscores the need for critical thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And relying on credible, evidence-based sources when we evaluate these kinds of health claims.
It certainly does. This has been a really thorough exploration.
Glad we could delve into it.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.